Hello, everybody. It's so wonderful to be here. I'm Maggie. I flew in from Chicago yesterday, so I'm working on enough sleep. Hopefully, David was saying nice things about me. I'm excited to be here. What a lovely city. Thanks for joining. And excited to talk to you all about metadata management. Quick show of hands, who here is on a metadata journey in their role? Thinking about it, kind of curious about it. Awesome. We have a lot of really exciting things to talk to you about. And honestly, I'm here to tell you, it's time to start working on metadata management like right now. Doesn't matter where you are in your data journey, how big your team is, there's just a ton to tackle in a very positive and exciting way. And hopefully walking out of here, you'll have some tools to kind of act on and get you moving. So, before we dig into that, I'm Maggie. I'm the founding community product manager of DataHub. I've worked in the data analytics, data engineering, BI engineering, analytics engineering, product management, engineering management roles over the past decade or so. And most recently, I joined as the founding community product manager for DataHub. DataHub is the leading open source metadata platform for the modern data stack. So there are a ton of buzzwords in that, but really DataHub is a tool for folks to really just start to map out and understand the entirety of your data platform, regardless of the tools that you're using, what stage you are in your kind of data journey. We have out-of-the-box integrations with, I think it's like 44 integrations at this point, adding to them every single month. We have a ton of companies that have already adopted DataHub, so they're using it within their organization. Also not listed on here is Volt, and it's been really exciting to like walk around Tel Aviv and see Volt everywhere because they're not in the States. So, so Volt is one of our adopters. And then let's talk a little bit about our community. We have just over 3,400 members in our Slack community, literally across the globe. Last time I counted, there were 56 people from 56 countries. It's probably more than that by now. But we have just a super vibrant community of data engineers, software engineers, data architects. We're seeing more and more data scientists, analytics engineers coming in. So just a ton of really great perspectives of folks coming in to really just start thinking and talking about metadata management, particularly with DataHub. From a collaboration standpoint, we have, in our Slack instance, we have around 900 to 1,000 weekly active users. There's people coming in asking questions, troubleshooting, helping one another out. We have like over 10,000 Slack messages every single month, which is a lot for me to keep up with, but I do my best. Another way that we come together is in our monthly town halls. So we host a Zoom town hall where we are going over new features that have rolled out. We highlight members from our community to kind of learn about how they're managing metadata or using DataHub, also highlight community contributions, et cetera. And then just from an open source perspective, the project all time, so it was open sourced a couple years ago. To date, we've had over 240 individual contributors to the project. We see over 200 PRs moving through every single month. So one of the things that we hear from our community members is just like the sheer awe of how quickly we're kind of cranking out new functionality. And a lot of that is driven by our awesome community. And then, over 5,000 GitHub stars. So that's a lot about the community, a lot about concretely what is DataHub doing. So just kind of a quick tour of this. What you'll see here is our kind of like unified search experience. So in thinking about all of those different data integrations that we offer, and really just the entirety of your data stack, DataHub is offering a kind of centralized search experience to really just kind of help you navigate what's in there. So you'll see on the left-hand side, just a way to kind of like slice and dice. It could be anything from an ML feature table, an Airflow task, Looker dashboard. We're really just kind of bubbling up all of this information in one spot. The other thing is really supercharging data discovery. So this is just a quick view of a dataset entity page. You'll notice there is a ton of content on here. So let's break down a little bit what's available. So we're pulling in information just simply about the technical schema. So just your basic column data type, but then some plain language definitions. We also offer a lens into how frequently are these resources used. So who are the top users? It gives you that context about how relevant it might be in your kind of discovery journey. We're also we also support applying kind of like a logical or business metadata to these entities. So it's not just the technical side of your data entities, but also how does this fit into your KPIs or your OKRs or whatever other acronym you want to throw out there. And then we also talk a lot about ownership. So what does it mean to be a good owner, a good steward of data? And really just kind of give that line of sight into, like, when you're on your data discovery kind of journey, who do you talk to? How can you start to escalate questions or issues that might pop up? And then last but not least, there's operational detail. We're going to dig into this more, so I'm just going to zoom right past that. Another huge component of DataHub is understanding the end-to-end lineage of data. Data lineage, I'm sure, is something that has popped up on your radar at this point, but really just kind of understanding the genesis of how data is generated, how it's transformed, and how it kind of steps through all of these different touch points. So in this view, we're looking at a data set that's created in MongoDB. It's then written into your data lake in S3 using an Airflow task, then loaded into your Snowflake warehouse using an Airflow task again, transformed using dbt, landed into Snowflake, and then ultimately surfaced or reported or measured in Looker. So again, it's really just going back to this idea that DataHub, at least DataHub and a data catalog in particular, should really be able to show you that through line of the full kind of data lifecycle. So you know a little bit about me, you know a little bit about DataHub. Let's start tackling some metadata management. And to do this, I'm going to tell you a little story about a company called Longtail Companions, where every pet is exceptional. And yes, this is a play on long-tail distributions because you're data nerds, I'm a data nerd, so of course we're going to do that. But so this is a fictional company, but really this is an aggregation of conversations I've had with hundreds of people within our Slack community to understand what their tech stack looks like, the problems they're solving, et cetera. So when Longtail Companions was first formed, it's an adoption agency that's matching every pet with a human. They spun up an adoptions team to build out an adoptions application. They're storing their transactional data in Postgres, and then the kind of application or like the document data in MongoDB. And things start going really well, and they realize, oh my gosh, we also need to make sure that every pet has a leash and a food bowl and food and all of those treats. So they spun up an e-commerce team along with data science to build out that e-commerce platform. Their storage system is Postgres again for the transactional records, but then they actually introduced Kafka to kind of understand the clickstream events that are coming through, how folks are interacting with their app. And they start to hit a scaling issue where they can't answer, or they can't really leverage this data in a way that is meaningful or actionable. So they roll out a data platform team who begin syncing all of this data using Airflow, landing it into S3 as their data lake, transforming it through some Spark jobs, and then ultimately landing it into their kind of centralized data warehouse as Snowflake. And then, of course, you actually want to make use of the data, right? Like you could just have it in your warehouse, but you actually want to do something with it. So they introduce an analytics engineering team who's leveraging dbt for all of their transformations, great expectations to start actually validating that data, and then ultimately surfacing in Looker. So I'm curious, like, is this a familiar story to folks? This kind of resonating a little bit? Right? So like each team individually, thank you for that. Each team individually has made kind of like the right tech decision for their own stack. But in reality, you end up with a really fragmented ecosystem that can make it really hard to know how to navigate it, know how to troubleshoot it. And so what they start to see is that folks are starting to ask questions like, if I need to push a breaking change, what dashboards are going to break? And how do I kind of proactively go about that? The data science team is cranking out new ML models, and they're incorporating a bunch of new data sources on a daily basis. But how do they make sure that they're not abusing PII or sensitive data in the long run? The data platform team is really kind of at the center of all of this complexity, and they want to make sure, how can I reliably, or how can I ensure that these resources are going to be up to date and accurate? Then, of course, you have the analytics engineering team who's at the tail end of all of these steps and just wants to know, what is the authoritative pet data set? Then, of course, you have your management team or your executives coming in, and they want to know, are we sharing any sensitive data with third parties? There are compliance issues we need to worry about. And then you have your business stakeholders who are maybe seeing, different measurements or different numbers of return rate, for example, and they just want to know, how is this calculated, and how can I be sure that I understand how to interpret it and act on it? So to answer all these questions, you start thinking about metadata management. So let's dig into this a little bit. I have 3 principles that I want you to hopefully walk away with by the end of today as the must-haves of metadata management. Number 1 is Metadata 360, this idea that you really need to start to stitch together both the technical and the logical metadata, regardless if it's a data set, if it's an ML model, if it's a task, whatever it might be, you really want to stitch together a full picture, a robust picture of that. The next is shifting left, so declaring and collecting metadata at the source where it's generated. All too often, what I've seen, and I am also extremely guilty of in a past life, is treating all of this enrichment as an afterthought and really just focusing on building and coding and cranking things out and yeah, I'll document or I'll explain that stuff later. And then you never do it, or it gets lost in a Google sheet, and the rest is lacking history, quite frankly. And then last but not least, the third principle here is active metadata. So actually injecting this metadata into the operational plane. Again, a little bit buzzwordy, but we'll dig into some examples of that. So let's dig into Metadata 360. So we've already talked about kind of the data set profile, right? All of the column level definitions or the technical schema, the owners, the tags, the terms, all of that fun stuff. But what you're looking at here is the output of a data profile or a snapshot in time of how that data was shaped. So this is super common. I'm sure you guys have done this individually to just kind of build out a profile, a histogram, or a just get a sense of how that data is structured. And so what we're doing here is executing this on a regular basis and building out a time series view of how that data has been distributed over time. This helps with debugging. It helps kind of bolster confidence in how reliable it is. So on any given day, are you seeing a bunch of outliers? Are things shifting over time? And it also just makes discovery a much quicker, right? You don't have to start doing these ad hoc queries to just understand what's the min, what's the max, standard deviation, all of that fun stuff. The next part is enriching these resources with query history or top queries. And this is super powerful because it allows you to kind of provide these data resources in context and how they're queried, how they're defined, and also just kind of gives you a starting point or a launch pad to start manipulating or using it for your own use cases. The next thing is, and this might be a little bit hard to read for folks in the back, so I apologize there, but this idea of validation. So for folks that are managing data validation through Great Expectations or SodaSQL, DQ, tools like that, or maybe honestly, maybe you just are kind of building out your own unit tests for your own, we can start to surface the outcomes of those so folks can get a sense of, first of all, is this data set validated at all, ever? And also, how has that changed? What issues have arisen or have arisen within it? And really just kind of bolstering the trust or the usability of that. And then last but not least, tying these data sets or these data entities, back to the kind of business definition of things. So what you're looking at here is a glossary term where we're providing not only just a plain language definition of what a metric means, but also the code along with that. And so really, you're starting to provide context to a wider audience, not just folks who are speaking fluent SQL or folks that just kind of want to understand the interpretation of it, but really providing that full picture of what that term or what that measurement represents. So by augmenting your metadata and pushing it into this 360 view, you're not just looking at table column structures, you're not just looking at a select star limit 10 from a resource, but you're really building out this kind of narrative around these resources to start answering questions about what's the authoritative pet data set, for example, or how is return rate calculated. So you don't have to be an expert in any one part of those things, but all of them are available to start stitching that story together for you. Next up, this idea of shift left. So this is one that I'm personally very, very, very enthusiastic about because I think it is critical to kind of meet people where they are and meet people where they're building, as opposed to trying to kind of like force new processes or new workflows onto folks for the sake of documentation. Like, let's face it, it's just an afterthought more often than not. So what we talk a lot about within the DataHub community is this idea of shift left and omitting metadata where the data is generated itself and where the code is kind of managed and maintained so that you always have kind of like the most up-to-date understanding of what's happening here. So in this scenario, for folks that are familiar with DBT, this is a schema YAML to define a DBT model. So in this model, we have this model called pet details. You just have your plain language definition. This is a table with all pet-related details. Very interesting, I know. But by leveraging the meta blocks within DBT, we can start to do things like assigning ownership. We can have this idea of model maturity. Is it something, like, is it still in development? Is it in production? We have Booleans around whether or not it's business critical or if it has sensitive information. And then also starting to tie things back to a domain. So for folks that are adopting data mesh, starting to tie those resources back to your data domains as well. And one thing to keep in mind, that within the meta block, all of this is fully customizable. You know, it's really just up to you in terms, or it's up to the team in terms of what information is important and how you want to scalably kind of capture and maintain that going forward. So now with tools like DataHub, what we can do is really like define and evolve those things as you go. So you can imagine for models that are in development, you're going to toggle between it's either in development or it's in production. You don't need to toggle that in your kind of like in your code-driven definition of it, excuse me, and then also define it somewhere else. You just do it once, and then we'll bubble that up into DataHub. So what you see here is, this is just automated mapping between these different YAML configurations, and then surfaced into DataHub so that we have our plain language definition, our tags showing that it's business critical and it's a production model. We're then assigning it to Shannon. So Shannon is our owner of this, and it's now within our data domain. So again, let Shannon focus on building out her DBT model, assigning it to different domains, assigning it with these different tags, all within code, and then basically kind of expect your data catalog, in this scenario, DataHub, to really bubble that up and maintain that context. For folks who are familiar with Kafka or working in protobuf, for example, the same principles apply here. So as you're kind of annotating your schema, that could be anything from providing, providing a definition. So in this one, we have an event emitted whenever a search is executed. We map that back to the definition of your asset in DataHub. Adding a classification. So in this regard, we have this data set is classified as sensitive, and then also asserting your owners as well. So same principles, but two different tools. The surface experience of it is the same within DataHub, but really what you're doing is tailoring it to the development patterns of folks who are maintaining those tools. So if you think back to Longtail's very fragmented data stack, all of that metadata is captured in each of those steps. And so the challenge is really to capture it at the source in a way that is, you're not forcing each team to adhere to a certain set of principles. Instead, you're kind of meeting them there and saying, help me understand where you're capturing ownership or where you're capturing whether or not something is classified or sensitive, and then bubbling it up in that way. And in doing that, if you think about kind of that lineage graph that we had looked at, there's a really, really robust knowledge graph underneath it. So as soon as you're able to start extracting this by shifting left, extracting it at the source, you end up with a really reliable view of all of these interdependencies and then a really rich understanding of how they all kind of work together. Now that you've kind of gone through those exercises of building out this 360 view, of extracting it from the source, you can start to be more proactive in understanding what the implications are of a breaking change, for example. So specifically in DataHub, we have this idea of impact analysis. Excuse me, impact analysis. So regardless of where you are or where a data set is on a dependency chain, it could be 10 steps from a breaking change or 300 steps from a breaking change. We offer the ability to kind of get that snapshot of all of those resources so you can start to proactively reach out to folks and start those conversations around breaking changes. I know that I'm personally guilty of pushing changes and just kind of closing my eyes, clicking merge, and praying that nothing serious happens. And so now what we're doing by really leveraging this robust knowledge graph within your metadata model, really you're starting to answer these questions like, what are the critical dashboards that will break if I push this change? And again, also tying it back to this question of how is return rate calculated as those definitions evolve with your organization. Those will always be up to date and just pushed out to your catalog as things go. Last principle, active metadata. So back to our beautiful lineage graph here. When we talk about active metadata, we're talking about starting to really leverage metadata and interrupt or inject it into operational or kind of process-driven components. So if we look at this, what a beautiful graph, so lovely, right? But you have a MongoDB data set that's synced using Airflow into S3, which is then synced into Snowflake using Airflow, which is then manipulated in dbt, written back into Snowflake, and then surfaced into Looker. So to just report on the bare minimum of the number of pets that have been adopted, you have 6 different touch points or 6 different platforms where something can potentially go wrong. Not to mention all of the probably repetitive or redundant steps that are within that. But there's just ample opportunity for things to break and ample opportunity for things to go awry. So when we talk about active metadata, really what we're talking about is leveraging, again, that knowledge graph to understand what happens if one of these Airflow tasks breaks. The Airflow task may be tied to Snowflake, but really what we should be able to do is take that information and halt execution all the way into Looker, so that if something breaks at step number 1, you're not pushing out or publishing information out, that would be misleading or incomplete or whatever that might be. The other thing that we do, that we talk a lot about, is this idea of propagation, or metadata propagation. This really comes back to this idea of dry coding principles, right? So don't repeat yourself. Now that we have this knowledge graph, why don't we just, quote unquote, why don't we just propagate this information or this metadata across the lineage graph? So for example, if you have new information about how something is classified or how it might be used, if it's business critical, apply it to a singular node and then propagate it across the entirety of your graph. The other thing that's really powerful is using, especially once we understand kind of the stakeholders involved, either through usage information or through ownership information, we can start to leverage this to provide alerting around delayed SLAs. So regardless of what platform you're using, you have a centralized view into how delayed or not something might be, and then we can start to push out notifications through Slack or through whatever alerting mechanism you'd like. So really this goes back to answering these questions of how can I be sure that I can rely on these resources to be up to date and accurate, and also this idea of how can I make sure that the things that I built are not incorporating potentially sensitive or kind of bad actor data along the way. So once again, you have 3 principles to keep in mind as you enter into your metadata management journey. Metadata 360, give it that whole view, that really robust view of what an entity looks like. It's not just logical, it's not just physical metadata, it's everything in between. In shifting left, extracting or define it and extract it at its source, so you don't kind of like halt that pattern of treating the enrichment of metadata as an afterthought. And then active metadata, where you're actually injecting it into these workflows and proactively interrupting as necessary, providing that alerting, etc. And with that, in my very humble opinion, you are now ready to tackle metadata management. The good news is you don't have to do it alone. We have a, like I said, very thriving and welcoming community in DataHub. We love welcoming folks to share their experience. We're here to help you, and I'm excited to hear what you all get up to. I will be sticking around afterwards if anybody would like to chat. We're also at Acryl Data hiring. We are a very, very international team. So even though I'm in Chicago, we have folks in India, we have folks in Hungary, in Portugal. So if anybody's looking for new opportunities, I'd love to chat with you as well. And thank you so much for your time.